Welcome back to the Mold Show. I am your host, Adam Horn, and as always, my co-host, Sean McGrath. I am a state of Florida licensed mold remediator, and Sean is a state of Florida licensed mold assessor, and together we bring you the Mold Show, which is our perspectives on mold buildings and homes and interior environments and what ultimately you should try to do to eliminate or tackle these mold issues. How you doing, Sean?
I'm doing great. It's great to be back on a podcast together, or episode together. I did a solo one with Micah several weeks ago, and we let you play host with Carly and Al a couple weeks ago. That was fun. I was on that, but just playing more producer role on that since there are so many people, but it's great to be back together here.
For real. I mean, I missed you, honestly, and it's good to be back with you, man. You know, we talk about mold even when we're not recording. I know it sounds weird to a lot of people, and obviously we're helping people with their challenges in their homes and businesses, and so it's always a topic of discussion, even in my home with my wife and her friends and her family and acquaintances. Somebody I feel like is always dealing with a water damage related issue. Shoot, it rained so hard here yesterday that half of Tampa flooded. It felt like I just constantly saw stories of people posting videos of water flooding into their lawns or right up against their homes. And it's always going to be a challenge here in this state and across the country, across the world, but especially if you live in a wet climate like we do.
Yeah, you're exactly right. We've had a lot of rain lately, and I know Florida's kind of associated with that. Now, that doesn't mean other climates aren't immune to water issues, but we've certainly been hit hard here recently. So what have you been up to lately? Where have you been? Where's life taking you here last couple of weeks?
All across this beautiful state of Florida. I was on the other coast earlier in the week looking at a project. And HVAC seems to be the main source of their issue. And we've talked about that, and we will be talking about that in greater detail soon with an HVAC expert who handles and tackles these mold related issues as it relates to the HVAC system, which in my personal opinion is typically enemy number one for people.
Well, it's the lungs of the house, so how could it not? It's a very important aspect. But you were on the other coast of Florida. I was actually on the other coast of the country a couple of weeks back. Brad and I were actually posting pictures of the airport we were at in Oregon, PDX. I guess it's known for its green carpet. So it was fun to play that game, posting a picture where we're at and having people actually guess the right airport. That was fun. But yeah, life's taking us everywhere.
That state.
Beautiful state. But Brad and Mike are actually in Texas. We're coming back from Texas today. So work's been taking us everywhere.
That's awesome. I don't travel nearly as much as you guys do. And you said it doesn't matter what climate you're in. I always tell people, do you have plumbing in your building? And if they say yes, then you too can also experience water damage and ultimately mold growth if it's something that isn't taken care of quickly. So yeah, we all face those same challenges, even you and I, in our homes, in our workplaces. None of us are excluded from having to deal with these issues. So that's why we do what we do, right? That's why we're doing the show, to kind of help people navigate that process, because there's a lot of myths and misinformation out there, Sean.
Well, that brings us to our next segment here. We want to do something a little different today. I think it'd be fun to talk about top 10 mold myths, if you will, and be some mold myth busters, if you will. These are 10 myths that I hear on a regular basis. They're probably things people listening have heard a lot too. So a lot of them are going to sound familiar. It'd be fun for them to kind of guess before we get into it here of what those top 10 are. These are from a combination of Chat GPT, asking Chat GPT, some websites that I found, some articles, and then again, things we hear a lot. But they all kind of align with each other, honestly. You're getting a lot of the same answers, a lot of the same myths. But before we dive deeper into it, can you think of 10?
I'm sure I could,
Well,
but
give me a top anyway.
off the top of my head, the one I hear the most is it's just mildew. It's just mildew. You're going to hear that a lot from maybe your air conditioning contractor, maybe your maybe your insurance adjuster,
Mm-hmm.
or your property manager or your landlord, or those who don't really want to use the mold word. Well, a lot of times use the mildew word. I guess that's an M word too, but use the mildew word because it's less scary and it doesn't have the same reaction or response. And people, for some reason, don't associate the two, mold and mildew, thinking mildew's perfectly healthy and perfectly fine to be around, but mold is scary and toxic and dangerous, and so that would be my main myth. I hear it all the time. People use it in and around other professional industries just to take people's awareness away from the problem that they probably do have or do have ultimately. And when you guys go into test, it's confirmed, but they come back and they say, well, I was just told it was mildew. So that's probably the main one I hear quite often.
Yeah, that's definitely on the list. It's down towards the bottom, but we can get in a little deeper, get into that one a little deeper towards the end of our conversation here. But we can just go maybe
let
me hear down the list here.
You got. Let me hear what AI has brought to the table in regards to the common myths out there, because I'm sure all 10 of them are things that we've heard pretty consistently.
Oh, yeah, we'll go down the list here and then we can discuss a little bit and go from there.
Mm-hmm.
But myth number 1, if I don't see mold, it's not a problem.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely heard that one. Wish that was the case. And ultimately sometimes we will open up walls and not visibly see issues, but it doesn't mean we don't need to attack, clean, and treat those areas just as if there was lots of visible growth. Because usually that means that there was some sampling done in those areas, and maybe it's just the dust left over from a previous issue or the building process, or there is some unknown source of growth that we're just not seeing yet. And a lot of times that means we have to look further, look deeper, broaden our scope of work to try to find whatever the source of that mold is.
Right. And I think that's probably one of the main hurdles or stumbling block that people have to get over right away. Because a lot of times when people are told mold could be making them sick, they don't see it in their house. So they just think that could absolutely just not be the problem. And they think they're in the clear, but that couldn't be further from the truth. Mold often grows in dark, damp places. It's very elusive, can be hard to catch. So we hear that one all the time, especially when we're having our initial consult calls. We really don't think it's mold because we don't see it.
Not only that, but it's not that it's elusive because it wants to be. It's elusive in for a lot of reasons, but mainly because it likes to grow in areas that stay wet and that don't dry easily when exposed to moisture. And that often means areas that are hidden from view because you have materials sandwiched up or trapped up against each other, like behind baseboards. You don't visibly see it. The rest of the wall that you can visibly see looks great, and maybe was able to dry from whatever moisture event occurred. But below the baseboard, that area stayed wet for an extended period of time. So that's just one area where you may see growth that you can't visibly see until you start peeling the layers back. But you can apply that same thought process and methodology to other areas where you have materials that are sandwiched or stacked together that won't dry easily because they're away from the air conditioning system. They're not getting dehumidified or ultimately getting even dried if you put equipment in to dry, because it's plies of material and ultimately they just stay wet for too long.
Yeah, I would say maybe the 2 instances where it's the hardest to convince people that the mold could be an issue or new construction, which we're seeing a lot more issues with that lately. and houses that have been renovated. The thought is we've replaced everything in here. There can't be mold. There's had this trouble understanding that during those renovation processes, there could have been sources that were ripped out, colonies disturbed, aerosolized, and could still be on the building materials that were covered back up.
Yeah.
And those can be really the hardest inspections on our end, is isolating where there could be a problem.
Right. Sometimes it's like a crime scene. You don't always see the body. Sometimes the body's already been removed
Mm-hmm.
and cleaned up to the best of whoever did that ability, but that doesn't mean it was cleaned up properly. And so there could still be some remnants or a lot of remnants left over from the actual issue, which ultimately can still cause problems. And we see that with bathroom renovations all the time, right? Somebody will just go in and gut it, tear it out, don't really clean afterwards, leave a bunch of moldy debris in and around the area, slap up the new material, throw in the bathtub, and visually, man, it looks like a brand new bathroom. But behind the scenes, ultimately, you're left with lots of debris from a issue in the past, and that debris has growth all over it, and people are wondering why they're still ultimately having issues. And so that's maybe one example of what we see when we tear out areas like that are newer.
Ready to move on to number 2?
Sure.
All right, myth number 2. You're going to like this one. Bleach kills mold. How many times have you heard someone say, not a problem anymore, I bleached it, I cleaned it, or heard people given the advice, just spray it down with bleach. It'll clean it. It'll kill it.
Your maintenance guys, it's their favorite thing to say. Your maintenance men, if you live in an apartment or you live in a building that has, a super or somebody like that who's responsible for coming in because you have that roof leak and bleaching and painting over it, you'll hear that quite often. And out of sight, out of mind is what they count on, right? You kind of goes back to what the first one was, which is if you don't see it, it's not there or can't be bothering you. And just because bleach turns it clear and maybe kills some of it, I don't know scientifically if it's right to say it kills none of it, but as a remediator, and I tell this to people all the time, my goal isn't to kill the mold. My goal is to remove it. Trying to kill biolife that's growing in unquantifiable numbers, that shouldn't be anyone's approach ultimately. If you can remove it, you should. And so that's definitely a good one. I feel like that one, though, more people these days understand that that's just not true, right?
I still hear it a lot more than you would think. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. People that, have consulted with people I respect, but I don't know if it's just that mental hurdle of hearing it your whole life that it still keeps being brought up. I don't know. But, bleach, it may be good cleaning surfaces, non-pore surfaces like glass, tile, what have you. But when it comes to wood and drywall, it's probably not going to kill it. You're pouring something that's toxic on something that's potentially toxic, and it's mostly water. So you're adding more moisture to that substrate that it's on, and you're not getting down and removing the roots, like you said, physically cleaning it, which is the most important part.
And I'll tell you what's even a bigger problem than just pouring bleach on moldy areas. And that's going in with your rag or your brush after you sprayed it with your bleach or you've soaked it down with your bleach, and then taking it and visibly trying to clean those areas, right? And then you're going into areas or touching material that didn't have mold on it. With that rag, you've now just tried to clean that area with. We've done this in our showers forever, right? And we wonder why mold just keeps spreading and spreading and spreading in showers. And I tell people all the time, you did that. Most likely. It may have started in one area, but then you took your brush and your Tilex or whatever product you decided to use and you sprayed it. And you took that brush and you cleaned that area and you cleaned the rest of the bathroom too. And all around the edge of the tub, around the corners of your shower, and you just seeded all that grout or all those areas with the spores you were just touching with your moldy rag or brush. And then you introduce water in a bath setting, and next thing you know, it's growing everywhere. You see it around AC vents a lot too, where people will try to bleach it wipe it off with a rag, and it looks good for a little while, but they haven't corrected the issue. And the next thing you know, it's growing and growing and growing all over the material around the AC vents.
Yeah, this might not be the best metaphor, but it's almost like using bleach is almost like putting a fresh coat of paint on a rusted car.
Mm.
You know, it looks clean on the surface, but underneath there's still a problem, and slowly it's going to continue to eat away until it resurfaces.
And that offends me because I like rusty cars.
I know you do.
I like patina, and why would you ever try to cover it with some ugly paint? Just let it be what it is. Enjoy it for what it is, because rust is beautiful.
I'm sure we've all seen those wonderful DIY paint job attempts on the road.
We definitely have. So those are some good ones for sure.
Well, let's go into number 3 here, and we kind of touched on this as our conversation started. But mold only grows in humid climates. I talk with a lot of people and say, I'm just going to move out to Arizona. I'm just going to move out to Utah, as if there's not water damage issues out there. Now, granted, maybe better from a rain and humidity standpoint, but we work with people all over the country. So just because you're moving to a drier climate doesn't mean you don't have to take the same necessary steps to ensure your living environment's clean.
Like I said, if there's plumbing, if there's water running through the walls, if you have air conditioning systems, you are also going to have potential exposures to water damage, which can lead to mold growth. Being in an arid environment, does it help? I'm sure it does. Things dry way quicker in those environments, but interior space wise may not have that much of a difference. The relative humidity might not be as high, but if those walls can stay wet because moisture is trapped between plies of material, or it's exposed on a consistent basis to moisture, it can grow mold. So while the outside of the structure probably not nearly as much, the interior of the buildings often suffer from the same issues. You know that because you travel to those areas. I know that because I just got back from Las Vegas a couple weeks ago, and my hotel room had lots of mold in it on the ceiling in the shower. Just looking into the mini split, which, you know, if you're not scared to look at mold, do that. If you don't if you don't want to see it, don't look into it because it's probably there. So I mean, it was extremely dry, extremely hot, and that particular room, like most hotel rooms, had an issue, and it was in that environment. So I know from experience as well that that's obviously false and definitely helpful, but not you're not going to be 100% able to avoid it no matter where you go on this planet.
Right now, not having to fend against the humidity we deal with down here, which we see all the time. People go away for months, come back, mold everywhere because the AC went out and humidity is through the roof inside the home.
Even worse when they go away for some time and the AC is running but not dehumidifying. Then you get your big issues because the cool air meets the humid air and it reaches dew point, and then materials absorb moisture right straight out of the air, and you reach saturation point and everything. And that's when you walk into the worst of all mold exposures, in my opinion, where it's just become a cave.
So I guess the reason we bring that up is, sure, you're not having to defend against the humidity issues in those climates. You're not having to defend against all the rain and water runoff that we deal with here, but don't use that as an excuse not to do your due diligence when you're looking at a place to live in and not to properly remediate or properly, defend your home against certain measures or take certain measures to defend your home.
I like this. These are good. These are good. And you know what? Comment in the chat. What's something you feel like you've heard that you're kind of skeptical about? And maybe we can talk about it on the next episode. Maybe we should tackle a mold myth every episode, Sean. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that'd be good. We can have a little segment on that. And I meant to bring this up beginning of our conversation, but yeah, looking at what's going on.
My light died again. I need to get some secondary lighting in here.
While you work on that, we might cut this. Who knows? Maybe not. I don't know. It's worth the effort. So everybody just bear with us here. Adam's still with us, but
I'm here.
There we go.
Let's get some more light. New light. Okay.
Yeah, just looking at some of the activity we're getting with the podcast and on YouTube. Best way to ask us a question or chime in with your thoughts, drop a comment in our videos on YouTube. Probably the easiest way for us to address those. If they're general questions, that's great. If they're specific to your situation, I mean, that requires more of a one-on-one conversation.
Yeah.
I think we can drop all of our information, our contact information into the video description as far as our websites and all that. And through there, you can find our email address and phone numbers for our businesses, or you can just email us at themoldshow@gmail.com. We'd be more than happy to help you.
We love talking about mold, and right now, we're in the fledgling. We're new to the podcast world, and now's the time to give us your questions, because eventually, we'll be inundated. We won't be able to have so much personal connection with people. Maybe, I don't know. We'll see. We'll always try to be available to you guys, though.
For sure. All right, number 4. Once mold is removed, it'll never come back.
Yeah, that's a big one.
I know you're dealing with somebody right now going through this, just major remediation and renovation, and unfortunately the source wasn't properly corrected. Now, I don't know that there's mold per se. I haven't been back there, but the water that caused these issues to begin with are back.
You have to tackle the source issues. You have to identify the source of the problem. If you don't, mold will come right back. I know it seems like an oversimplification, but it's true. Just think about it from a roof leak perspective. You could replace all the materials on the inside of the house. You don't correct that roof leak, it's going to get wet again, and you're highly likely to also have mold growth issues. When it's right in your face, when you know what the source is, a pipe leaked, the shower pan is bad, a roof leak, usually removal is going to take care of the source, because you're going to be forced to correct the issue by repairing it. But not always the case with every issue, especially when you're dealing with HVAC related issues, where the HVAC is the source of the moisture or the mold or the problem, or things that you can't ultimately identify. You're not sure if it was something from an old, the previous owner took care of it or not. And so sometimes you have to chase down source issues or try to recreate events. I'll use a window as an example. If the window is leaking, sometimes by the time we get out there, it's completely dry. It's hard to tell when it occurred. Maybe the window is a newer window, but there's damage there to the materials in and around and below the window. And so I always tell people to get their windows leak tested while the material is out. After we've removed all the drywall, whatever from in and around it, try to make that window leak. You can hire a leak detection company, or you can do it yourself. See if you can get moisture to come in around the window before you put the fresh new material back in. Ultimately, that will help. Same with roof leaks and round chimneys and building envelope issues. You want to try to recreate the environment before you put the new material back in. If you do get it to leak, make sure you dry it pretty quickly. But that's really the best way to ensure that you've corrected the source issue, because if you don't, mold will grow back.
Yeah, and there may be some people listening kind of roll their eyes at that myth, and if so, that's fine. But the reason why I included it in this list is we deal with people on a daily or weekly basis that are coming back to us with the same problems that they had to begin with.
Yeah,
so addressing the source always needs to be something that is considered as part of the overall budget and not just the remediation. Because if you don't address that, honestly, it's all for nothing. You got to take care of why the water event occurred to begin with.
Yeah, I agree. Otherwise, it's you're just putting yourself back at risk again to have to deal with it again. And so that's not something you really need to take a half measure with. You have to correct the source issue. Have to.
In some cases, it can cost just as much, if not more, than the remediation itself. But it's something that's so necessary.
If you need a new roof, or you need all new windows, or you have structural issues or drainage issues or grading issues, or whatever the issue, the plumbing's bad, there is going to be an expense involved with correcting the source problem. but that has to be first on the list. And sometimes it has to be done in conjunction with the remediation. Sometimes you can do it beforehand. Sometimes you can't do it until after. So each problem brings a unique challenge, and that's why spending the time to figure out why is important. And really, figuring out why before you do anything is probably your best bet, because once the conditions have changed, it's much, much harder to recreate it in some cases, especially if it's building engineering, building engineered, like you don't have enough airflow in your attic, or you have cold and warm air mixing when they shouldn't, or humid air mixing when they shouldn't. As soon as you change that envelope or you tear out all the materials, you've changed the condition, so it's hard to recreate it. And I've had clients who have had, looked after the fact and have not been able to really find the smoking gun, which is unsettling.
Yeah. All right. Moving on to number 5. Mold isn't a problem in new homes. That's another one we touched on a little earlier, but we're finding more and more issues with new construction, especially with the huge housing boom we're having down here in Florida. I can't speak for other states, not as familiar with how rapidly they're building houses in other states, but it's becoming a major problem down here, Adam.
It's the most frustrating thing. I just went and looked at a house last week, 3 or 4 year old house, I think it is. The HVAC issue, ventilation in the attic is an issue, causing a dream issue for these people, and it's a newer build, probably their dream home. And in no world should they have to be dealing with this type of situation, because it's not going to be a simple process to correct. And them and their neighbors and everybody in their neighborhood, they have other neighbors who are dealing with the same issue, or trying to put all the pieces together and trying to see if the builder will take responsibility, and that's always a crapshoot at best. And it sucks. It really does. And the build quality is a problem in the state. It has been, at least as far as I know, for as long as I've been around. It's just continuing to get worse when demand outweighs supply, and they're just throwing up communities and buildings left and right. Quality suffers. And quality of work, quality of the materials, because costs go up. They end up using cheaper building practices and methods, and finding skilled labor to do the work is difficult. And because of that, we inherit buildings that weren't built properly, and now you've got lots of people with new buildings suffering from issues that they absolutely shouldn't be.
Yeah, we seem to be becoming enemy number one with some of these builders down here, with the issues that we're finding and trying to address. But the houses are going up so quick that there's almost no time to change things with how they're being built. So it becomes this domino effect of house after house after house having the same problems. Down here it seems to be specifically the HVAC and the ventilation in the attics, as you just mentioned. It seems like the tighter we're making these homes, the more important that becomes. But we keep seeing it as a problem. We keep seeing it.
I don't see an end in sight either, man. I wish I did. I wish the state would get involved, or I don't have a good answer for it. It's like a lot of issues that we deal with societally. And this is just one of those things that you hope you never have to deal with, because it's a big problem. And that's another reason we decided to do this podcast, is to make you aware of the issues that you could be facing, so you can, before you purchase a building or before you build a home, try to get out in front of this if you can. There are better ways to build homes. There are better ways to build wet areas and buildings. And we hope to share that information with you over time, so that you can understand the pitfalls of owning a building, or where and how these exposures can occur.
My advice with new construction would be to find a custom home builder who seems to, they seem to take things a little more serious when it comes to setting things up properly, or hire an inspector to work with you throughout the entire process of the build, to check the vapor barrier as they put it down with the slab. Check the pre-drywall framing and all that. Just step by step to make sure things aren't missed. I mean, I'm sure you've seen the lumber just sitting out in these yards and how
Yep.
moldy and nasty it is. And a lot of times you can't get them to remediate that before drywall goes up.
Yeah. Yeah, it starts with the building materials, right? What are we using? Are they being selective? Are they being careful with that material? Because yes, you can just slap drywall on a block or frame structure, and you could be covering up an issue that occurred during the process, or even just came on the truck that way. And the more the builders take it seriously, the better it is for everyone. But right now, most of them, at least in my experience, don't care. And because they don't care, it doesn't seem to be something that they even consider unless somebody knows what they're looking for, or ultimately has dealt with this type of thing before, and is involved in the process early on. And even then, the builder might not do it the right way, because we've had clients who've asked those things, and ultimately it's done incorrectly. Tough one, honestly. Tough one. Not really a myth. Well, I guess it could be a myth, that people assume that it's a new build, and I guess that is a really common myth. They assume new build means clean.
Nope, not going to have any problems. All right, number 6, don't have to spend a ton of time on this, but small amounts of mold are harmless. This really just comes down to the person that's exposed. We've both worked with people, I think, that are just debilitated by small sources in a home. Just happens to be how close to where they spend the most time, what the exposure is, what type of mold that's affecting them, which is the reason why I have such a difficult time with this 10 square foot law, rule, whatever you want to call it here in Florida. If it's less than 10 square feet per se, don't have to be a licensed professional to remediate.
Hmm.
People take that as I can just rip it out. Who cares? Which we both know most of the time it's not just that small little less than 10 square foot patch of mold we're seeing. Usually there's a lot more hiding behind the surface. And B, you can take a small problem and it turns into a whole house issue because you're ripping things out without it being under containment. Now all of a sudden you've cross-contaminated other areas of your home, your ventilation system, and so forth. So this idea that a little bit of mold isn't a big deal, I have a hard time with.
I do too. I mean, quantity doesn't matter to me. As a remediator, I have to treat it the same regardless. And protection and prevention during removal is important. I mean, that's really, in a nutshell, what remediation is. So whether it's a 2x5 section of material, which is like the size of a person, maybe a smaller person, it's a lot. That's a lot. Often you don't visibly see that much, until you start pulling the materials apart. Seeing a section of visible growth that's 10 square feet typically means you got a big problem on your hands. And that's not just the only area that has growth. So
you probably can't even quantify the number of spores,
no,
microscopic spores in that small.
Our brains couldn't even begin to understand that amount. So, we're not here to scare you, but we are here to caution you.
You'll take it seriously.
Take it seriously.
Yeah.
If there's visible growth, it might be that iceberg, right? It may just be the tip that you're seeing. And ultimately, there's a lot more that you can't see, because as we talked about earlier, a lot of times it's in the areas you can't see because those are the areas that stay wet. And so you may be like, oh, it's just a small area. And then you get into it, and then it's too late. If you haven't put the protection up and done what's necessary to protect yourself and the environment, you could be making it a whole lot worse.
All right, number 7, if it's behind the wall, it's not a problem. You usually hear this a lot from spouses that are in denial that mold can be the reason why someone's sick. It's hard to get people to understand that just because it's behind the wall, it doesn't mean there's not pathways where these microscopic spores that can be what 0.03 microns in size, which again we can't even see.
Yeah.
Just how the difference in pressure and air, and how air moves into these and out of these interstitial cavities, how it could be affecting someone.
It goes back to like nobody can say for sure what an exposure in a wall cavity or in a space that's not your interior environment. Nobody can say for sure how much of an effect it's having on somebody. If you've tested it and you know it's there, uh, why wouldn't you do what's necessary to try to remove it or clean it off the surfaces it's growing on? But, even if it's structural. I hear it as well. I don't ultimately have a answer for people, and so I know if it's there, I want to go after it. Typically, how much of the spore you're being in contact with, how much of the mycotoxin you're being in contact with. I don't know that there is a testing method or device that can really measure that.
Hmm.
So, being that it's such a big unknown, and ultimately, if you already know you have sensitivities, why would you ignore it?
Yeah, what I can tell you though is, we're in a lot of houses where we take the outlet covers off, which those outlets are not completely sealed around the
Yep,
drywall.
yep,
Same thing with shower valves and other wall fixtures. At the bottom of the baseboard, sometimes you still see gaps, and again,
yeah,
that's
oh, yeah.
open to the wall cavity. And we're talking about spores you cannot see with your naked eye that don't need a big pathway for air to pull in. So sometimes when we have those outlet covers off, when we have those valves off, and we're evaluating inside the wall, somebody walks in inside the front door, you can feel the air pressure change. You could feel air being pulled from those interstitial cavities. Again, it doesn't take much to disturb these spores, aerosolize them, and pull them out into the ambient spaces of our house.
Correct. Yeah, and you don't need any of that at all if it's getting wet and producing new molds, which are then producing mycotoxins. Then it's a vaporous, gaseous, you know, mycotoxin that you're likely, if you smell it, you're probably being exposed to it. I think it's pretty easy to draw that line, right? If you can smell it, it means it's probably in the air and ultimately coming from somewhere. And so that in itself tells you that it's making its way through the materials. And that is usually, or a lot of times, the first thing people notice is the odor.
And I think that's why the ERMI sampling methodology is so big right now, especially in the medical community. If they want people to test what's in the settled dust in their house, because ultimately, if those spores aerosolize and escape those wall cavities, they're going to settle on your horizontal surfaces in the house. So it could be a good screening to help us understand cross contamination and what has actually aerosolized and migrated from the sources inside the walls.
Yeah, I go back to being like a crime scene analyst. Sometimes it's difficult to tell. You don't know the history. You don't know how many renovations have been done in that building. You don't know what's from what ultimately. So you have to follow your context clues. And testing is vital information to kind of help you piece the puzzle together. And whether you're able to figure out where, or when it came from, ultimately you then have information that tells you what it's like now, and then that should push you to do further, more evasive investigation into areas you think may have issues,
Well
whether they
said.
tested hot or not, tested elevated or not. Um, sometimes it's worth looking in areas that have a higher likelihood of having exposures. And if I'm in a remediation and there's been areas that have been identified as having potential or as having elevated levels of spore growth based on samples, air swab, composite samples, I will often encourage the building owner to look deeper into other areas I know based on my history, like other under windows. Let's take the baseboards off, in and around wet area behind the toilet as finished carpentry goes up against showers and tubs. If we're already in that space and it's part of our containment plan, then why not get more aggressive and look deeper? because sampling is a snapshot of an area, and that may give us a visual on areas that ultimately will give us more information.
Yeah, I kind of have this visual in my mind of when there's a fire in a house. Certainly, it's going to be worse where the actual source occurred, but you still have, the smoke that does damage in other areas of the house, and it usually tapers off the farther you get away from it. Mold can be the same way, which is why we'd like
the
to.
air conditioning is running, it'll pull it up into the system.
Yeah, which is
Throughout other areas.
Again, is why we like to perform a wide range of sampling methodologies to not only help us understand the sources, but how they could have moved about the home.
Correct.
Number 8, you can just paint over mold to get rid of it. This is more of a. I still hear all of these. It's funny, but this is more of like a landlord special type myth, I think. Just paint it. If you don't see it, out of sight, out of mind, not a problem anymore.
Similar to the bleach method.
Yeah, and I think this is more of a problem too with maybe some of your, I don't want to say worse remediation companies, but remediation companies that aren't as educated as they should be when it comes to remediation. A lot of times they'll go in and they've removed the materials, but then just painted over the studs. There was no sanding, wire brushing, no HEPA vacuuming, thinking it's, you're just going to get rid of it. But yeah, please don't paint over mold. Doing so can make it feel threatened. And just like us, if we feel threatened, we're going to fight back. The way molds do that is by producing their mycotoxins if possible, and can make things a lot worse rather than better.
Yeah, I think encapsulation has a place, but it is a final step in the process that has a lot more steps to it. And removal of everything you can remove down to the structure, and in some cases structural if the homeowner decides to go that far, especially if there's rot or deterioration or the structural issue is the problem, then you have to address those issues. But just using it, removing it, and slapping paint over it is not how it's supposed to be done. And so ultimately, even if it gets that far, you and I both know that a lot of times they just paint it. They don't even remove the material at all. That isn't mold remediation. Neither is bleaching it. It's an issue for sure.
And I feel like we hear that more now when people think it's just quote unquote mildew, not mold, just mildew, which we'll get to here in a second. I think because it's mildew, you don't have to physically remove the drywall. It's still penetrating the surface of that drywall, the surface of the paper. No matter what type of mold it is, need to get rid of it. Can't just paint over it. Number 9, if an area isn't actively wet, there can't be mold. So what I hear from this one is all the time too. We talk about this all the time. A lot of people don't know any better. So this isn't poking fun at anyone by any stretch. But that was an old leak. We took care of it. Not wet anymore. It's fine. It has a mold inspector trying to deal with these historical issues. My head and my ears perk up like a dog when you ask them if they want a treat, if they want to go for a walk. I want to know more about that event. What exactly happened? What all they know was impacted? Because I want to go in there and dive deeper with our endoscope cameras and so forth. And I definitely want to test from those areas. Those are some of the hardest sources to discover. A lot of times people don't even know they happened if they weren't the owner of the home when it occurred. But when I hear that, again, my ears perk up. I want to go check that out further.
You don't know the history necessarily. And you may not know the history in a building you've lived in the entire time, because sometimes exposures aren't visible. Just like you can't see all molds, you can't see all moisture either, unless you have the right tools and moisture meters or thermal cameras, or you're there for the event. We've had crazy rains here. If you're away from your home for a little while, you come back and you don't visibly see moisture, it doesn't mean that it wasn't exposed at some point. So none of us know the full history. You can't see within your walls. Most people aren't going up in their attics on a consistent basis to monitor the attic health and the roof health and things like that. You typically don't see it until it makes its way into the building environment. So we know as people in this world, in the restoration world, in the mold world, that we can go out and take readings. Sometimes it dries. Your air conditioner will dry, will dehumidify the space. And so it got wet, it stayed wet, and then ultimately dried over time. Doesn't mean there wasn't an exposure. Doesn't mean that exposure didn't lead to mold growth. And so while the samples or the tests may say dry now, doesn't mean it's always been dry, which means you could still have an issue there.
Yeah, and those areas actually concern me more, honestly, than the active water issues.
Yeah.
A, they're harder to find. B,
Yep.
it gives people this false sense of security that since it's dry, it's not a problem. Why I'm so much more concerned about it is, A, we don't know how long it went on. And there's, again, no evidence of the extent. But B, if that colony starts to dry out, it makes those spores easier to break apart, to fragment, to separate from the colony, which ultimately, if spores fragment, that's going to be an ultrafine particle that's easier to aerosolize up into your breathing space, easier for you to inhale and for it to get into your system and your bloodstream. So I always, again, that's why my ears perk up, is because it concerns me when we had these historical events that may be dry now, but were never properly remediated.
Or were hidden
Yeah.
because they bleached it or painted over it,
Mm-hmm.
which goes back to the other two myths out there that are common. And so you just bought this house and nobody disclosed an event. Maybe they didn't know about it. Maybe the previous owner did, or the previous landlord or the property management company just did a half measure to take care of it. Invisibly, looks great. But behind the scenes, as you dig deeper, you find that it isn't, because it's been covered up or taken care of by somebody who didn't know how to take care of it properly. I'm not saying it's always bad intentions. Like, a lot of people just don't know any better. And I realize if I wasn't in this weird industry, I would probably be handling it the same way most people do, which is to bleach or paint over it or tear it out without any kind of containments, or do what they have to take care of the issue the best way that they know how. And that can lead to these issues. And then you move into the building and then you inherit issues. So yeah, this is a big one for sure.
The last one was your top one. It's not
Yeah.
mold, it's mildew.
Right.
Which I think a lot of people, like you said, they tell themselves that, or other people tell them that to make them feel better. And I think what people are referencing when they say mildew is just the surface growth that you see maybe in shower grout line, or on the ceiling of a bathroom that's not properly ventilated, or the surface growth we see when there's been exposures to high humidity for a long time in a building. I think that's what they're referring to, as opposed to the water damage specific colonies and mold that you can find. But that doesn't mean it should be taken any less serious. I mean, mildew
No,
is mold. There's a reason why it's happening. It's a symptom of a bigger problem, which is moisture. And we need to figure that out so it doesn't come back.
that right there. You can't visibly diagnose what it is. First of all, you can't look at it and say that's mildew, or that's this or this or this. Testing is necessary we know what you're dealing with, if it's what type of fungus it is, what type of mold it is. And ultimately they're usually all at the party, right? And some may be deemed more passive, some may be deemed more aggressive. Doesn't mean you're not sensitive to a specific type of fungus or mold. And so ultimately just saying it's mold or just saying it's this downplays what it ultimately could be. And it's, as we've seen on reports, it's usually a lot of different things, not just one type of thing. And I tell this to people all the time. Testing isn't designed necessarily, or isn't there just to tell you there's mold. A lot of times we know there's mold, and there's mold in the environment, and you take a swab of dust and there's probably going to be mold in it. But ultimately we need to know what type of mold and in what quantities of molds. That's ultimately the information that's useful to a remediator and to an assessor, so we can come up with a plan of action in order to try to lower those levels and get that house or building back to a normal fungal ecology.
Yeah, and it helps us better set the roadmap and expectations for the homeowner of what might go into it, which if we're not doing that, just kind of blindly getting into the project and who knows what to expect. Who knows? I mean, we've seen things go sideways quickly without having all the information.
Yeah, you want more information, the better. And one more thing I'll say about funguses and molds, and you've probably seen it. I know I have. I've seen mushrooms growing, in interior environments, out of carpets, mushrooms growing out from underneath the baseboards. And sure, that's a fungus, but like you said, Sean, it usually means something's wet.
Yeah.
It's not going to just grow for nothing. And it's probably not the only thing growing in that space. And while you might not be sensitive to that mushroom, maybe you are, I don't know. Everything that's growing in there along with it, and there's probably a variety of different types of funguses and molds. Ultimately, you probably don't want it in your inside environment. Therefore, it's a big red flag.
Yeah, if there's anything that we want to stress from this myth, it's not mold, it's mildew. This may be something I start saying a lot over the course of this podcast. When you start seeing things like that, it's a symptom of a bigger problem, and that's some sort of moisture issue. It's a symptom of something going on in the house.
Yep. It is. It means water damage. You can just say that something is getting wet that shouldn't be getting wet, or staying wet that shouldn't be staying wet. And so simple as that. It's a beacon that's flashing, that's saying, hey, look deeper here. You could have a real problem. Maybe it's minor, maybe it isn't. Minor to you might not be minor to me, or your infant, or your elderly grandmother, or your immune compromised wife or husband. So we all have to weigh all those things and make a decision that's best for us. And in this world, we want you to gather all the information you possibly can and make a decision that best suits you. And that's why we're here.
All right. To recap the 10 myths about mold, and I don't know that these were in any specific order, by the way, as from a priority standpoint, just ones that we felt would be interesting to talk about. Number 1, if I don't see mold, it's not a problem. Number 2, bleach kills mold. Myth 3, mold only grows in humid climates. Number 4, once mold is removed, it will never come back. Number 5, mold isn't a problem in new homes. 6, small amounts of mold are harmless. 7, if it's behind the wall, it's not a problem. Number 8, you can just paint over mold to get rid of it. Number 9, if an area isn't actively wet, there can't be mold. And number 10, it's not mold, it's mildew. What did we miss? Did we miss any that you would have put inside that 10? Do you have any thoughts about what we discussed? Agree, disagree? Have anything you want to add? Let us know. Like we were talking about earlier, you can comment underneath our video on YouTube. That's the best place. I think both Adam and I can see that and get notifications for it. Let's talk about it. You can bring up other things that maybe you want us to discuss in future episodes, but we'd love to hear from you.
Absolutely. Always enjoy doing this. We do it for you guys, and ultimately we do encourage you guys to ask questions. We really would love some feedback, and maybe you're starting at step number 1, you just don't know where to start, and really just ask us, and we'll try to give you some direction for sure.
Yeah, we're going to start providing our websites in the description of the videos. It's probably the best way to find us. Go to our websites. There's plenty of areas where you can find our contact information. Reach out and we'll chat.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. We'll see you on the next one.
See you guys.